Coming up on Network Africa, South Sudan's president says he is ready to accept a peace deal with rival leader Riek Machar. Ethiopia appoints first ambassador to Eritrea in 20 years. And the United Nations report says it has discovered new HIV infections in some 50 countries. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker. We begin in Sudan, where President Salva Kiir says he is ready to accept a peace deal to end a civil war and set up an inclusive new government. The deal, which is being negotiated, would give the country 5 vice presidents, including 1 woman, and also cover security and power sharing. President Kiir and his rival Riek Machar signed a permanent ceasefire last month, although there has been some violence since that agreement. In 2013, when the fighting broke out, more than 4 million people have been displaced by the conflict. And still following the historic peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has appointed the first ambassador to Eritrea in 2 decades. Rewad Hussein, a former ambassador to Ireland and communication minister, is now Addis Ababa's representative in Asmara. This is another stage in the rapidly improving relations between the 2 neighbors after fighting a border war. And just yesterday, commercial flights between the 2 nations resumed. In the meantime, Eritrea's pro-government press says the country has withdrawn its troops from the border with Ethiopia in a gesture of reconciliation. This is a major development in the whirlwind peace process that the 2 countries have embarked on. Some 80,000 people died during a 1998-2000 war between the 2 nations for control of the border town of Badme. A UN-backed boundary commission ruled in 2002 that Ethiopia should cede Badme to Eritrea, but it refused, and the 2 countries remained in a state of no war, no peace. However, Ethiopia's prime minister has promised to hand over the territory, but it is unclear when this will happen or when Ethiopia will withdraw its troops stationed along the border. And newly released U.S. intelligence documents show that the Federal Bureau of Investigation continued to investigate South Africa's anti-apartheid icon Nelson Mandela as a potential communist menace. Prop to the People, a Washington-based group which had sued to obtain the papers, say even after his release from prison in 1990, he was still being followed. The group says the documents reveal that just as it did in the 1950s and 60s with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, the FBI aggressively investigated the U.S. and South Africa anti-apartheid movements as communist plots imperiling American security. Mr. Mandela was South Africa's first black president in 1994 who advocated reconciliation with white people who had for decades enforced the racist system of apartheid in the country. Joining us now is an international affairs analyst, Calvin Dark. Good to have you on the program. What do you make of the recently released U.S. intelligence documents? Nelson Mandela was regarded with suspicion by Washington during the Cold War and also remaining on the U.S. terrorism watch list until 2008.
Hi. I actually wasn't that surprised, as were many people in this country weren't surprised, as I'm sure around the world. Our intelligence services have a long history of persecuting, harassing, even doing more to our own civil rights leaders in this country, such as Martin Luther King. So I wasn't really that surprised.
Now, the Washington-based group Property of the People said it obtained the documents after years of litigation. What do you think the group is hoping to achieve with the release of this information?
Well, I think one of their goals is to make sure that people realize that a lot of times people in power and influence try to sugarcoat history. Some of the very people that were against things that they would never dream of speaking out against now were, in fact, opponents of equality and justice. So I think exposing that hypocrisy is one reason. I also think the second one is transparency, and especially in today's world in the United States, but also around the world, transparency is one of the most important parts of democracy, and is they are trying to show that government leaders cannot act in secret, at least not forever.
Should we expect any reaction from the U.S. government on the information contained in these documents?
No, and especially not for the Trump administration. We need to keep in mind that the reasons why Mandela was under surveillance with communism and the Cold War, those same feelings still exist among a lot of people in positions of power in this country. We still have members of Congress right now, a handful, who voted against Martin Luther King's holiday in 1983. So I don't expect to see anything from Congress or this administration, because there's still people that aren't quite sold on the idea that Mandela stood for.
Calvin, in your own opinion, does the release of this document take anything away from the speech by former U.S. President Barack Obama, who was an essay to celebrate Mr. Mandela's life?
No, and first, I just want to say that Obama's speech, it was such a stark contrast. You had the former U.S. president hailing equality, justice, honoring one of the icons of equality around the world, while the current U.S. president was saying that the free press was the enemy of the people and cozying up to Russia. Now, when it comes to the effect it had on Obama's speech, I think it actually supported it, because Obama and Mandela, along with many other leaders, show how far we've come, but it's also a sign that we have a lot more to do, and if we're not vigilant, then the same things that we're uncovering today will happen in the future. So we got to stay woke.
All right, thank you so much, Calvin Dyke, International Affairs Analyst, for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
The UN Special Representative to the African Union says that the complex peace and security challenges on the continent cannot be addressed by the UN or the AU alone. Addressing the Security Council, Sile Workzwede called for the continuous partnership between both organizations. She says the African Union is the UN's most important strategic partner in peace and security development, as well as human rights. She stresses the need for more joint missions that will aid the progress towards solving the issues of peace and security.
The complex peace and security challenges we face in Africa are such that neither the United Nations nor the African Union can address the challenges on their own. Partnership is therefore not a choice, but a necessity. The two organizations recognize their interdependence. Support operations should be
and the Joint United Nations Programme on HIV/AIDS, UNAIDS, has issued a report which found that new HIV infections are rising in some 50 countries. Medical officials say this should be a stark wake-up call to countries that time is running out to reach the 2020 targets for HIV. In a report titled "Miles to Go, Closing Gaps, Breaking Barriers, Righting Injustices," the UNAIDS warns that the global response to HIV was at a precarious point. Global new HIV infections declined by just 18% in the past 7 years, from 2.2 million in 2010 to 1.8 million in 2017. UNAIDS says the decline was not quick enough to reach the target of fewer than 500,000 by 2020.
State of emergency in Turkey.
A new UNAIDS report has found that gains made for children are not being sustained. New HIV infections among children have declined only 8% in the past 2 years, with just over half of all children living with HIV receiving treatment and 110,000 children dying from AIDS-related illnesses last year. The report also noted that discrimination by healthcare workers, law enforcement, teachers, religious leaders, and others is preventing young people and people living with HIV, among others, from accessing HIV prevention, treatment, and other sexual and reproductive health services.
Back in Nigeria, hundreds of commuters were among the first to travel on a newly launched light railway in Nigeria's capital, Abuja, this week. The government is working to improve transport infrastructure in the country, which has affected economic growth over the years.
Hundreds of Nigerians were among the first passengers on the light railway network in the country's capital that marks a rare transport project launch in the nation where economic growth has been marred by a lack of infrastructure development. The passengers took to the Abuja Light Railway system, the first phase of which took 11 years to construct and was opened by President Muhammadu Buhari last week. It connects the international airport with other parts of the city. Nigeria has the largest economy in West Africa, but growth in the continent's top oil producer has for decades been stunted by its poor transport infrastructure. President Buhari, who took office in 2015 and hopes to secure a second term in next year's election, has vowed to address the problem. Many people who work in Nigeria's capital live on the outskirts of Abuja or satellite towns due to the high cost of living in inner city areas.
It's timed and there's no obstruction, no hold up, so it's a very perfect arrangement. And I think this will impact positively on the economy, on the economy of this country. When this is replicated all over the place, there will be less pressure on our roads.
In fact, the train have advantage more than the car. When you look at, consider the cost of the journey and then the risks involved. And secondly, the convenience. Look at how the place so space.
The first phase, built by China's Civil Engineering Construction Corporation at a cost of $823 million, comprises of 45.25 kilometers of track on 2 lines. When completed, there will be 6 lines and 292 kilometers of track.
For me, it was a nice experience boarding from central part of Abuja to the airport. If you want to go by road, it's usually a very long distance and it's quite expensive. But with this train now, it makes life easier. You can catch your flight going by the train. If you want to compare it to using the road, where these cab drivers, popularly called the taxi drivers, give you a bill of almost 2,500 to 300 to 3,000 naira. But with this system, I think it's really a welcome development.
It was announced last year that the Chinese state-run company would also construct the second phase of the network. Buhari's government has been looking for partners to overhaul its aging railway system. Nigeria's rail lines were mainly built by British colonial rulers before independence in 1960.
The project started in 2007, and it was an outstanding and an ongoing project. Now, it is very important to note that completing this project will ensure that massive employment happens. A lot of residents of FCT and including Nigerians will be employed. Now, directly, we are looking at employing at least 1,000 people directly. Now, indirectly, you are looking at over 20,000 people being employed.
The government plans to revamp about 3,500 kilometers of existing narrow gauge lines from the southwestern commercial capital Lagos to Kano in the north and from southeast oil hub Port Harcourt to Maiduguri in the northeast.
Still in Nigeria, the police commissioner of Zamfara State, Kenneth Abramson, has been explaining the events that played out when armed bandits attacked several villages on Tuesday. He told Channels Television that security personnel has been deployed to the affected communities to prevent a recurrence. According to eyewitnesses, armed bandits invaded 5 villages of Gidan Gogo district in Maradon local government area Tuesday morning, shooting sporadically at residents and carting away cows. In May this year, no fewer than 30 people were killed by suspected armed bandits and cattle rustlers in an attack on Malkawa village in the same district.
We are alarmed this morning to see a news report indicating that in a fresh attack that 30 people have been killed, and without giving the specific date of the incident. So I'm using this medium, this platform, to give you the correct victims of that attack. The first one, there were no victims in the area of recording death. But in the second segment of the attack, while the bandits were fleeing from those 2 communities, 3 people were killed. No arrest has been made, but we are in the process. We are need to have been doing coordinated bushcombing. It has always been a standard operational procedure that whenever there are incidences, even before, what we do first is to establish what we call fear reduction patrols, so that with the patrols we can stabilize the community and allay the fears of further attacks.
Still watching Network Africa. Still to come on the program, Tunisia passes anti-corruption law that could indict senior officials. Please stay with us.